The policy forum which we're bringing here together is going to look at a theme which is very close to our heart, which is bridging the gap between marketing and policy, and which is almost at the core of who we are as an organization. WFA was founded now almost 66 years ago with a dual mission statement which hasn't actually changed. We're interfacing with society to champion the license to operate of brands. So we do the policy work. We work with you guys day in, day out, in Brussels, in Geneva, in Beijing, in Sao Paulo. And we work with marketeers. Why is that actually such an important issue today? More than probably ever before. Probably for two reasons. One is because in a digitally connected world, there's simply no more silos. No? People won't differentiate between your brand communications and what your company stands for, the way your company behaves and what you say on your products. It's going to be one and the same. The other thing is that increasingly, society won't tolerate inconsistency. They won't tolerate saying one thing in brand marketing and behaving differently as a company. And so we see this, this evolution day in, day out in our work. But the way we want to talk about it is not only under the angle of what's the threat, what is going to force us to change. We want to look at it also in terms of what's the opportunity. In policy discussions, we too often have this tendency of looking at how are we going to be containing that threat, how are we going to be mitigating that risk. We tend to be pretty defensive. That's almost in our nature. We want to look at this challenge here also from an opportunity point of view. What are we missing today in having that gap? No? And I would argue we're missing an awful lot. No? In companies which tend to be, whether we want it or not, usually quite company-centric, very much focused on their values, and where people tend to be looking at the outside world through lenses, we would argue that you policy people are among those which are most interfacing with the outside world than anyone else. No? And so you just add the conversations you may have with NGOs, with regulators, with health groups, with all sorts of societal stakeholders. You probably have more of a sense of where the conversation is going than people inside of the company. And you're using that in your day job in order to be protecting the interests of your, and championing the interests of your companies in a very technical function, which is the policy work. But we would argue that a lot of the stuff you're learning there also includes insights which could be enormously valuable to companies as they think about the future strategy of growth. No? And we see that also in our conversation with CMOs. Whenever we're able to just take a step back, remove all the references to resolutions and articles in directives, and talk about the sort of insights which we're gathering through these weak early signals, we get a lot of their attention. Because change in society has never been perceived by CMOs as a risk. To the contrary, marketers live on change. They need change in order to be driving innovation, in order to be standing out from competition. And so this ability of looking at what's changing around us and distill that in the conversation potentially provides a huge opportunity for policy people to be an integral part of those strategic conversations. So we, as an organization, have a few very, very strong convictions. Yeah? One is we're absolutely convinced that policy people put together with marketers have the ability of projecting opportunities of growth for companies. So we see inherent value in being able to foster the dialogues. Secondly, we think that actually there are cases which demonstrate today already that when you bring them together, some companies have actually brought them together in their organizations, you can actually outperform competition. So we're not talking about an abstract concept, we're seeing some companies apply it. Yeah? We also think it actually requires top leadership from the top for that to change. No? It's not only a question of policy people changing the way they talk about what they do. We think there needs to be also a commitment by the top of the company to do that. And finally, we think actually, and we want to challenge you, that there may be a need to change the way we talk about the work we do in order to be relevant to marketers.
I think personally it's about having a common language.
They need to develop a common language.
Actually speaking the same language.
Common language.
I would say it's language and perspective. I think both are talking about the same thing, but from very different perspectives. I sometimes liken it to two neighbours talking over who has the best view from the other side of the fence.
I think it's very important for marketeers and public affairs people to get a better understanding or an understanding as good as possible of the work that they both do, because they're two different worlds and they shouldn't be, because they have a lot to do with each other.
One of the challenges might be also in terms of how we look at each other's KPIs. So public affairs colleagues look at a time span of sometimes 2, 3, 5 years ahead in terms of where they're headed, what their priorities are, whereas marketeers have more immediate short-term deliverables, and sometimes that connection needs to be found and it's not as easily identified.
Marketing people often don't know of the existence of public affairs people. Public affairs people are actually really important. It's just marketing people don't know it. Why are they important? Because they are like a life insurance policy. So it's something you don't really want to have, but you need to have. And at some point, you will need to understand what it means.
Corporate affairs and public affairs associates are extremely valuable, and if only marketers talk more to them, I think they would, as a result, have a much stronger corporate and brand reputation. The one word I would say was adventurous.
Rich, creatively rich, diversity rich, and energy rich.
Creative.
Creative.
Aspirational.
Passionate.
I hope they would say insightful.
I think they probably say challenging.
Necessary, I hope.
Principled.
Boring.
So a word to describe how our operating and working together would be in 5 years' time: symbiotic.
You know, I hadn't seen that video in the past, sort of before this session, but this nature of common language, right, is something that I feel like I've been grappling with kind of my entire career throughout my sort of 8 years at PepsiCo, 8 years at Visa, and now in a role at Edelman, which spans both public affairs and the brand sort of sides of the work that Edelman does around the world. And you know, and as I was sort of thinking about this session, I was trying to grapple with, it's actually a more difficult question to answer than I thought it would be, which is how do you sort of build the case for public affairs and marketing to work together, and what are the kind of the strengths that you kind of get out of that. I do remember at a very sort of personal level joining you know, PepsiCo back in 2003, and as the newly appointed government relations executive for Europe, and turning up to a number of quarterly business review meetings, and you sort of two-day meeting, review all the business. I'm sure many of you have been in these situations, right, where you do a QBR, or a monthly business review, with your senior management around the table. You go all around and you see, you know, how's the business doing in the UK? What's it doing in Western Europe? You know, and you have the leads from all of those businesses talking about that, and we'd turn to the marketing team and they'd talk about what growth in particular segments, what's stemming that, where are the obstacles, and all of this. And then you get to two people right at the very end of two very, very long days of doing all of that. Legal, and then government relations, right? And this was almost like, I always felt like the afterthought around that management table as we looked about this. And I would sit there through all of these long sessions, listening to all of the language about the business and marketing, sort of washing over me, trying to learn the language, and then desperately trying to think about how at the end of the day, I, as the government relations executive, was at all going to make an impact in this meeting, because all I had to do, bring to the table, was all of these regulatory threats that I saw sort of facing sort of the business, and a depth of knowledge about how, for example, the European Union was going to be applying against that. this was the challenge always around that table, was how to make what I did seem relevant and necessary. And I remember very clearly after my first presentation doing that, I had labeled the presentation, I think something like GA, Government Affairs sort of update. And after the meeting, somebody comes up to me and says, I want to just give you a tip for an in-house role. Every time you put GA, it stands for General and Admin Expenses. It's the thing that we all cut the most quickly when it comes to budget reviews around all the tables. So you need to find a different way of sort of describing what it is that you do so that you're not seen as G&A as part of the business. And that was a little bit of a first sort of wake-up call as I realized that I really had to work hard to try and figure out what it is that we do and how it begins to apply as much to the business, because I knew instinctively that what I'd come in to lead was a strategic function, which had far more sort of insights, foresight, ability to look around the corner at things that were happening than any, for example, as I anticipated our marketeers would do, who, as far as I was concerned, were focused on some very, very short-term goals of, of lifting sales quarter by quarter. And honestly, I would say, throughout my experience, it actually took the food and health debate, still raging well today, to really galvanize the company to understand that there's no way that any of the food companies would be responding effectively to this if there wasn't a unique sort of partnership coming together between public affairs and marketing, not least to transform the portfolio, the way in which we sort of label the products, and of course, relevant to everybody in this room, how we approached responsible marketing kind of to children, issues which I know are still very familiar to many people in the room today. But that was where I really sort of learned this understanding of how you bridge both. So I have a few slides. They're really just a sort of a thought starter as a way to sort of start how we think about building the case for marketing, public affairs to begin to work together. And you probably won't be surprised to learn that, a lot of it genuinely begins with this sort of understanding that a brand's cultural purpose platform is this intersect between brand relevancy and business reputation. It's where these things kind of come together in this world that begins to build and earn trust and builds a sort of societal value. You all know all of this because WFA is an organization that's been focusing on this nature of purpose for sort of a long time. But I think it's something where all the data that at least we're seeing is showing is a bigger imperative to ever. And if there's one platform which should be bringing together both organizations, both sets of brand ambassadors in one way, it really is in getting this right going forward. I have a few slides from this year's 2019 Edelman Trust Barometer, many of which have you seen and many of which you're familiar with the study. There's just a few slides contextual to sort of explain why we think that the imperative for brands to respond to societal challenges that government relations and public affairs executives can be heart leading is more important than ever. Because it's a world completely out of balance when we look at it. So those of you who may be familiar with the work that Edelman's done in trust for a long time knows that we look at trust in four institutions: business, media, NGOs, and government. We've sort of tracked this Edelman has tracked this now for 20 years. And we tend to look at rises and falls in the ways in which different countries' citizens look at rises and falls in trust in those institutions and rank order them sort of year to year. What's interesting about this year's sort of rank order of trust is not necessarily who falls to the top and who falls to the bottom, though that's always kind of like very interesting when we look at this. It is the fact that on the left-hand side of the screen, you've got the informed public, right? So these are people who are higher educated, higher paid, they're high news consumers, and then you've got the mass population group, sort of everything else. And blue is an indicator of trust, and green is an indicator of distrust in the markets in which they sort of live. So when you compare sort of the two, you can see that you've got a mass population tends to generally distrust institutions in the world, and on the left-hand side, amongst the informed public, a public that tends to be more trusting of institutions. So you've got people around the world that are living sort of two different realities. And that's important as we start to think about how brands begin to relate and think about their purpose in the world today. So at a macro level, we start to kind of look at and unpick some of the fears that people have, which are very, very real. This is one chart that we've taken out of from multinational employees and how they think about fears. And fears of job losses all around the world remain high. Fear of not having the right training for the future, automation coming in, and how in the last year trade policy and new tariffs coming in are producing genuine fears about the future of their organizations, and people are concerned about this. There's many other topics as well we could add into this. Immigration is a big one, but these fears from employees working within companies all across the world we're seeing as being high, and they're ones that brands need to be seeking to think about, address. So this is sort of data point number one coming after that big slide, the macro slide. The second is that in the developed world in particular, people are pessimistic about their future. This is the box on the left-hand side, which is kind of called out. 14 markets in which the majority of the mass population, not the informed public, but the mass population believe they will not be better off in 5 years' time than they are now. So you can relate it to fears and concerns, you can relate it to other questions around growth and just their quality of living. But you have a world in many of these markets where people are concerned. And people's concerns affects consumption, it affects confidence in the world. And so this is another area that we need to look at. In fact, over the 28 markets that we sort of look at, only 1 in 5 people believe that the system is actually working for them, including the way in which they think about brands responding to their needs. So imagine this picture in your world, first of all, of generally a world which is distrusting of institutions and that is not confident at all about the future. So hypothesis around this is we've started to see over the last year unrest in various areas. Now, would we be able to say whether this is a trend or not? We don't know. But broadly, you can kind of see on the left-hand side of the screen sort of the disenfranchised, sort of generally, whether it's the Gilets jaunes in Paris or it's the Women's March in India looking for equality. You've got disenfranchised groups really sort of starting to think about, we're not happy where we are in the world today. We don't trust the institutions to confidently lead us into the future, and so we're starting to take to the streets. Is this happening everywhere? No, it's not. Could it be something that increasingly is likely if institutions don't trust what we're seeing as this sort of trust gap? Maybe. On the right-hand side of the screen is a kind of like much more interesting trend that we're starting to identify. These are employees, and they're US employees, and they're not exactly disenfranchised for the system, but there are concerns that they're beginning to have about the way in which their companies operate. So this nature of, there's this notion of values of an organization that are above the water cooler in the break room, and how employees perceive whether or not their employer and their companies are living up to those values around all of this. And particularly, as we've seen in Silicon Valley over the last year, among some technology companies, we're starting to see these beginnings of this kind of unrest and unhappiness about the way in which their brand's technology is beginning to use. So Amazon workers walking out, working conditions, but also concerns about automation kind of coming in. You know, the question is how long does it take before we see Facebook employees beginning to really get unhappy with the way in which they see their employer taking stands on issues, responding to various things that are going out? Is this a technology sector phenomenon alone? Could it lead into other companies and brands? Well, it might do if they're not seen as being responsive to societal conditions, and if employees believe that there is a gap between the values that you purport to stand for and the actual actions that are taken. And so in all of this, we often track the degree to which society is looking from leadership from CEOs around the table. And we have seen over the last year a big jump by 11 points in that to 76. There's an urgent call for action amongst many people who are respondents to our survey, at least, that are saying we expect CEOs to stand up and take a stand, to move into the breach, not address every issue that's out there, but address some issues that we see as real concern. And also, we've been looking at, from the Earned Brand study, this notion that people do believe that brands can be an effective force for change. 46% of people who say brands have better ideas for solving a country's problem than governments, and 53% believe that brands are actually doing more to solve these issues than government today. Right? So this mandate and this expectation for CEOs to lead, for brands to lead, is high. Relate that to a world of sort of distrust in what we're seeing, and you begin to see how the call to action on companies is high. Belief-driven buying is becoming more mainstream around the world. We're seeing an uptick across almost all the markets that we surveyed, particularly in these 8, China, Brazil, India, France, sort of, etc. And what do we mean by belief-driven buying? What we mean is that these are people who are willing to, or at least they say, they're willing to hold brands accountable for the actions that they take or do not take in response to societal issues. In fact, 2/3 of people, up from 50% the year before, now classify themselves as being belief-driven buyers. I will take action either to buy or not to buy from a brand that I believe is taking a stand on issues that are important to me. So with that sort of data, I believe that it begins to kind of paint a bit of a framework for thinking about how public affairs practitioners and marketers start to think about their brand's role in society today. And if you start to think about, if you accept the notion that purpose is something that needs to be focused on, and a brand's cultural purpose is something that is going to give credibility and meaning to consumers and all sorts of stakeholders in the world, then my belief is that you can't do that unless you have both the public affairs community and the marketing community working together. So this sort of framework that certainly is one that we've started to use to talk to organizations about how to think about identifying purpose, sort of has the idea that that in order to be seen as a purposeful, contributing company, you need to act across 2 different axes. And one way of thinking about this is that the vertical axis is really, in many ways, the world of sort of public affairs, and certainly those people that look at social impact, which is, what are those kind of issues in the world today that we believe our employees, our stakeholders, regulators, consumers expect a company like us to be taking action on, because we can look around the corner and see this as being some real problems, but also an opportunity that we can address. And then along the horizontal axis, sort of think about this as being the business or the marketing imperative, which is the degree to which you begin to change your business model and think about how you produce and how you deliver services sort of very differently, things that impact the business. And it's the intersect between these 2 things that really leads to purpose. So if you start to populate this with some examples of brands or brand executions, you begin to get an idea, and we can debate the relative positioning of some of these campaigns on the slide today, but hopefully you'll get the point of view and sort of perspective that we're trying to sort of put forward here, which is that, you know, if you look just up the vertical slide here, you begin with the Nike Colin Kaepernick campaign sort of a year ago, certainly on the US side, which captured a lot of people's imagination about African American black rights in the US. You know, there was no sense that Nike was necessarily changing its business model in going down all this, but it did capture the imagination of it being a stand that they believe the company should be taking. If you look on the horizontal sort of slide of the scale, again, we can kind of debate the relative positioning. Something like a CVS, the convenience chain in the United States, choosing to remove all of its tobacco from all of its stores everywhere in the US, changing its business model, but probably being no more than just simply responsible to societal expectations. And then a whole host of sort of other examples that you can kind of put in there, and you can sort of think through the relative impact of these campaigns and how they change the views or not of the brands that were associated with them. The point here, and this is just what I'll end on, is that I guess my belief is that as we start to consult with organizations and think about those clients of ours that are moving more progressively in the area of being seen to be responding to societal actions around the size, it is when the public affairs community and the marketing communicators are coming together more systematically to think about what that intersect is, that you start to get the magic to happen. When I was at Visa, the last sort of 4 years I spent before leaving that company, I was head of global financial inclusion with the company, and I truly believe that financial inclusion was one of those win-win roles that a payments company should be involved in. Why? Because financial inclusion, which is this notion of providing financial access to people who are excluded all around the world to safe and affordable financial services, this is something which, number one, was seen as a poverty alleviation measure in the eyes of governments around the world. Number two, there was this perception that if Visa, other payments companies, were seen to be very active in this space, then they were beginning to get into a firmer dialogue with regulators around the world who were intent on growing their homegrown payment systems. And so there was a real sort of regulatory issue. And then from a business perspective, it was seen as a business growth driver in developing markets because you were driving transactions onto the Visa network from which Visa over the long term kind of would gain. So that was an opportunity to really sort of look at how you could bring together in a purposeful way all of these different elements in a way that would have Visa showing up differently and contributing. It tended to inspire our employees. We got the business behind it. Marketing was interested in driving all of that forward. And the thing is, at the end of the day, it came fundamentally out of this government relations proposition that we had to find a way of having a more in-depth, responsible way of showing that this particular company, Visa, was contributing to society, and that at the end of the day was a defense mechanism to protect our license to operate around the world. I'm not saying that's the best example or indeed the only example that I've been involved in to kind of do all of this, but I do think it kind of like helps sort of shape and suggests a way in which we could begin the conversation today. So that's what I wanted to do, just to kind of give you a few highlights, get the discussion growing, and Will, I think turn over to you to take us through a little bit more of the detail that was coming out of the study. So thanks, and I look forward to the discussion.